I'm Will.
And I'm Clark.
Today we're going to be talking about Unit 10 of Meyer Psychology.
Let's get right into it.
So now, let's talk about the fundamentals of personality. Clark, start us off.
Be glad to. Just for a refresher, personality is essentially who a person is. But let's also understand Freud's psychodynamic theories, which view personality with a focus on the unconscious and the importance of childhood experiences. But let's also look at free association, which is where in psychoanalysis, it's a method of exploring the unconscious, in which the person relaxes and says whatever comes to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing. Feel free to pause the video here and write down some of these key terms. So Will, can you take us through Freud's theories of the mind?
Sure. So Freud split up the mind into three layers, and he split up personality into three parts. Let's start with the mind. Freud split up the mind into the three layers: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. Conscious is the aware side, our thoughts and perceptions. Then on the other extreme, you have unconscious, the background processes of our mind, the ones that we aren't even aware of. And then in the middle, you have preconscious, which is essentially composed of thoughts that could be unconscious but can be pulled into the conscious sphere. Next, Freud goes on to split up personality into three parts: the id, ego, and superego. Id is essentially our animal instinct, our desire for reproducing, eating, and sleeping. Then, on the other extreme, you have superego, which is our moral compass and our conscience, what we think is right, what we think is wrong. This part of personality focuses on the ideal decisions. And then in the middle, you have the ego, which decides, should I give in to id or should I give in to superego? You might want to write these notes down to reference later when you're studying for a test, for example. Clark pulled up this amusing cartoon, which essentially demonstrates how id, superego, and ego work. In the middle, you have ego, which has to decide between id, the animal instinct or the devil, and the superego, or an angel. Okay, Clark, so why don't you walk us through personality development?
Let's start with psychosexual stages, which are essentially childhood stages of development, with a focus on distinct sexually stimulated zones, which result in identification and fixation. Identification is when children incorporate their parents' values into their own superegos. For example, say your parent is part of some political party. You may be more likely to inherit those values. Additionally, fixation is when an individual fixates their pleasure-seeking energies on a certain psychosexual stage due to an unresolved conflict. For example, say you have an unresolved conflict in your phallic stage, which is when, say, you're 5 years old. You'll be more likely to be attached to your mother. If you're a boy, and girls will be more likely to be attached to their father in their later years. So write some of these down so that you can remember some of these key terms.
Okay, as you can see from that clip, the character Mr. Bean is crying for his mom because he failed his test. And that is, of course, him going back to his phallic stage. By the way, Clark, I saw you doing that on your AP Calculus test.
Do not expose me on the internet.
Moving on, you might want to write these things down in your notebook to reference back later on. Okay, now let's talk about the Neo-Freudian and later psychodynamic theorists. These theorists accepted Freud's ideas except in two ways. They placed more emphasis on the conscious mind, and they doubted that sex and aggression were all-consuming motivations. Some of these prominent thinkers include Alfred Adler, Karen, who has the unfortunate last name Horny, and Carl Jung. Alfred and Karen agreed with Freud on the importance of childhood, but they disagreed about sexual tensions. Carl Jung first followed Freud and then broke off. Instead, he mistakenly believed that all humans share some common images and experiences, which we know now is not true. These are images of Carl, Karen, and Alfred.
So moving on, we're now going to start talking about assessing unconscious processes. So some tools that psychologists use when assessing unconscious processes are projective tests, which are words, images, or situations, which are presented to a person, and the responses that they produce are used to understand that person's unconsciousness.
The most famous of these tests are the famous Rorschach ink blot test. Let me basically explain this through a little satirical clip we made.
Hello, my name is Therapist Johnson. What's your name?
Yeah, my name is Will. I came here for the ink blot test.
Oh, for sure. What do you see here?
Kind of looks like a taco.
Are you sure that's what you see? I'm pretty sure this represents the existential crisis of all humanity.
No, I'm pretty sure that's a taco. And you're whack. Therapy sessions. As a side note, there's a number linked somewhere that's apparently for therapy sessions. Don't dial that. That's probably a text scammer. Anyway, Clark, let's move on.
So while the psychologist in that video may have been a little bit misleading, Rorschach ink blot tests really reveal unconscious aspects of one's personality and emotional functioning. And the TAT tests illuminate people's inner motives. So as we see in this image here, the psychologist will ask someone to interpret what the image is representing, illuminating that person's motives. But also, let's understand how modern research contradicts many of Freud's ideas. So some things that we've contradicted are that development is lifelong, not just fixed in childhood as he prophesized.
As you can see in previous slides, Freud placed a very important emphasis on childhood. And while childhood does play an important part, unlike, according to him, we believe that childhood isn't the only thing that contributes to development of a person.
Also, many of Freud's theories aren't exactly proven with much concrete evidence and don't follow many rules of scientific observation that make them credible.
However, some of Freud's ideas have endured over time. For example, Freud drew our attention to the unconscious and the irrational, and he challenged our self-righteousness and exposed our defense mechanisms. Next, let's talk about modern research on repression and the unconscious mind. Contrasting to the former ideas of repression, modern ideas on the subject believe something different. They believe that traumatic memories that are pushed into the unconscious mind can be retrieved, unlike Freud, who believed that once a memory went into the unconscious, it just stayed there. But speaking of the unconscious, modern research also has different ideas on the unconscious layer of the mind itself. Remember, Freud said everything intense goes into the unconscious layer, but modern research says that the unconscious controls autopilot actions, like background processes that we don't really think about. Next, Clark is going to talk about humanistic theories.
So next, let's talk about humanistic theories and how Abraham Maslow coined the self-actualizing person, hierarchy of needs, and self-transcendence. But first, let's understand humanistic theories, which study personality with a focus on healthy personal growth, self-determination, and self-realization. He also coined the term hierarchy of needs, which basically stipulates if basic needs are fulfilled, people will strive towards self-actualization and self-transcendence, essentially moving up the pyramid we see on the right. But self-actualization and self-transcendence are defined as the following: the process of fulfilling our potential and meaning, purpose, and the identity beyond the self.
For example, not crying on a calculus test gives Clark meaning. Moving on, let's talk about Carl Rogers and his person-centered perspective. Clark?
Rogers' person-centered perspective suggested that the ingredients of a growth-promoting environment are acceptance, genuineness, and empathy. And within acceptance, we find that the unconditional positive regard is a caring, accepting, non-judgmental attitude, which helps people develop self-awareness and self-acceptance, improving their growth in their environment. But also, let's understand self-concept, which is an idea about all of our thoughts and feelings about ourselves, in answer to the question, who am I?
That's a very easy question to answer. You are a bad therapist. Next, let's talk about assessing the self. No, it's true, you are. Let's talk about assessing the self. Humanistic psychologists assess people in a variety of ways. For example, Carl Rogers, mentioned in the previous slide, used questionnaires in which people described their ideal versus their real self. This makes complete logical sense, right? If you describe to a therapist, this is what I want to be versus this is who I am, they can judge process throughout therapy to see if you are getting closer to what you want to be. Additionally, some humanistic psychologists use interviews and conversations because they were critics of standardized tests. Speaking of critics, let's move on to evaluating humanistic theories. Critics are everywhere, and there were a bunch for humanistic theories. They argued that humanistic theories were vague and subjective, and that these theories were assumptions that were too optimistic. However, humanistic theories were very important because in general, they laid the foundations for modern psychology. Alright, that's it for this video. There is more on this personality unit, so we are going to continue this in part 2.
See you there!